All right. Good day, everybody. This is Kubernetes SIG architecture meeting for August 26th, 2021. We have a short agenda, but I think the second one's going to be a little bit of a talking extravaganza. So let's get started. Why don't, Rian, you start out with the first item here.
All right, thank you. It's a short one. As all agreed in the community, I changed the meeting to a monthly meeting to increase people's ability to attend. And the tests are getting more difficult, so it's less churn and it takes longer to get things on the board. So a monthly would do. But I forgot to make the PR to change all the documents. So there's the PR for the documents. If somebody can just approve that for us, please.
Okay, sounds good. Unfortunately, I won't be able to make the first monthly meeting, but hopefully the next one after that, because you moved the time on me. All right. Okay, thank you, everybody. Any other comments on that? Okay. All right, so I guess, Rob, you want to jump in on this kind resource convention?
Yeah, thank you. And I recognize that this is somewhere between SIG Arch and SIG API machinery. The link I have is just to the mailing list thread, which actually goes to both SIGs. And we've had, I think, decent discussion around that. I think there's any number of ways to kick this off, but I think that the real background for anyone who's missed the thread is that as we're developing Gateway API, when we started with our first alpha release, we had references to using kind, which at the time matched the API conventions of the day or what we were used to. As we're moving to V1 Alpha 2 and trying to become an official K8s.io API instead of the experimental Kubernetes API, we are going through a formal API review process. And Tim pointed out that, hey, the API conventions have changed. The API conventions now state that all our object references, which we have a lot of, should now use resource instead of kind. And we're looking at this as a project that is already introducing a large new API as yet one more thing that will potentially confuse users, add additional complexity, and we're concerned about that. And so we're trying to find ways to either hopefully be able to continue with our existing resource reference structure, so using kind, or at least understand more why we should move away and have that documented more clearly. Following through all of the thread, I was hoping that we could come to two conclusions. Now, this may be me misunderstanding the thread before, and I'm sure someone will correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like it's a bit of an edge case to declare different resources with the same kind and group. It is possible, we've definitely clarified that, but it's not done in core. And it seems like something that adds a fair amount of complexity, and things like clients like kubectl just don't behave well with that. So maybe adding a recommendation that is not something that makes sense in a lot of cases. And then secondly, adding some kind of guidance that if you're going to create an object reference type and it's going to refer to different resources with a shared kind, we should use resource. But otherwise, kind is sufficient and matches everything we've done in existing Kubernetes APIs to this point. So that's my introduction. I see there's already some discussion here, so I don't know who had the first hand. Maybe David?
Thanks. So I want to point out that you don't know in advance whether your kind is going to be reused by another resource. So an example of this would be something like a token review or a subject access review from authentication K8s.io, right? You can create another resource, maybe token review OpenShift or authentication OpenShift.io. that accepts the same kind. It accepts the same kind and returns the same kind. And that makes it compatible with hooks, for instance, that expect one or the other. And there's no way to know that in core. Another place where this has significant utility is when you're dealing with admission webhooks. They all have the same kind because that's the way the API is defined. The server reaches out with a admission review something K8s.io. But when you shape servers, if you shape them to look like aggregated APIs, they can accept the same kind at different resource destinations. There are many advantages to actually structuring it that way in terms of authentication in the system. And so I think saying not recommended means that interoperating in that way becomes not recommended. And I'd be hesitant to do that.
That's a good point. I was unaware of those specific use cases. Is it fair to say that those are very specific uses of this pattern and we can describe them? But you know, like I'm very familiar with the gateway API use case, and I know that this kind of pattern does not seem to make sense for gateway API or anything that we're referencing. So it seems unfortunate to change, you know, to go against what users are most familiar with the kind and object reference, just for the sake of the possibility that someone may use, you know, the kind more than one to refer the same kind in the same group to refer to different resources. I think we have a pretty good handle on what we're going to be representing or referencing in Gateway API, and it seems somewhat orthogonal that yes, there are some use cases where you may want to use kind for more than one resource, but that seems like it has a number of issues, and maybe we just need to highlight the shortcomings of that approach. Not that it's not valid, but that it for instance does not play well with kubectl as an example. Does that seem fair, or maybe that is, I don't know.
I see Hippie has a hand up, and he's talking on mute.
One of the things that we've noticed over time in trying to write the conformance suite is we focused on the endpoints or the actions of how you interact with the Kubernetes API, which was the easiest way to pick up and hold and define the formal definition of Kubernetes from a tested perspective when there are different implementations. I wonder at this juncture where there was a moment where we looked at possibly looking at kinds and all of the attributes there and how we interact with them in the different actions. It feels uncomfortable to me as someone who's been working for years to help define the Kubernetes API in a way that we have these conformance tests defining them, to move away from that simplicity. It would be interesting to hear some clarity on the reasoning. I apologize for not having read this thread before, but it definitely startles me. And you have my ears.
So I can't see hands on Zoom Web, but I'm gonna, if nobody's gonna tell me that I'm jumping the queue, then.
Yeah,
Jordan
you are.
and
Jordan's next, and then me, and then you can go. It's hard to find. It's under reactions. There's raise hand.
Yeah, reactions, and then click on participants and you can see hands. But yeah, it's hard
Look
to
at
find.
that. There it is. Thank you.
One thing to note to what Hippie just said, so the conformance tests which focus on endpoints, those are actually using resources. So the focus on endpoints is testing resource coverage. So if we're trying to decide between kinds and resources and how we reference things, anything that is endpoints based is talking about resources. So pods, nodes, things like that. To Rob's point, I think there are a few different ways references are used, and they have to do with whether the controller or whether the thing looking at the API object expects lots of potential references pointing to data in different locations. But when it fetches that data, the controller expects to understand it and expects it to be uniform. So an example of that is the auto scaling controller, where the references in an HPA are pointing at different places the autoscaler can find and speak a scale object. And so that's one pattern where the thing in the reference is really supposed to be a coordinate for the controller to go chase. But what lives at that coordinate is expected to be consistent and understood by the controller. So that's using references as coordinates. Another pattern is where the reference, there's a small set of expected objects, and the fact that it's modeled as a generic reference is maybe misleading. And maybe this was getting to what Rob was talking about. So like in the RBAC API, we have a reference object, but really we only allow that to specify a cluster role or a role. And it's only one of those two things. And then the third case is where the reference can be used as like an extension mechanism. And I think this is what ingresses used references for, where you have a resource backend and you can say like, whatever ingress controller is serving this ingress, like here's a pointer to the parameters for that controller. And it might be some custom type and it might be like, who knows what it is. But presumably that ingress controller knows how to interpret that data. When it's a pointer to some custom thing, you can kind of fall into one of two scenarios. One, it's expected to be like a CRUD type that you could cube control apply the thing. And so in that case, expecting it to be like a one-to-one, like the kind pointing to the first resource serving that kind that cube control apply worked with, like that's probably reasonable. If it's the second example where it's like HPA, and really you're just trying to point to an endpoint where this controller is going to pull data from, then the resource side is more important. So like I can see both sides. Like if it's a CRUD type, then yeah, it probably doesn't make sense to have more than one in the system. If you're going to be cube control applying this thing, it's not going to work well for you if you're expecting to be able to write to some other random resource. If you're using this just as a coordinate for the controller to pull information from, then I don't think it's a good idea to chop off the power of the API and say, nope. Like it might have worked great for you to like provide an aggregated API server that surfaced this information using some totally different mechanism, and you speak these same types in order to be interoperable. But nope, we're not going to let you point references at that thing. I'm done. You're up, Tim, or maybe John.
Yeah, it's me. So that I don't know, what you said made sense to me. I guess what I would ask is if there's not, and this is I think what Rob is getting at too in his thing, is there not a pragmatic solution here where if you use kind, it's a sort of canonical, it represents a canonical resource location for that particular kind, and that the reference could alternately use resource, and controllers or clients know when they see kind, that means the canonical version. For built-ins, that's easy. I can't say for other things. Um, you know, but we still allow resource in the cases where we need it. It would seem that that's sort of aligns with the sort of does what the user expects it to do type of mentality, as opposed to being precisely correct. Anyway, that's all.
So the use of resources in tests seems completely appropriate and okay, because that's not something that users are going to deal with, right? Most users, I guess I'm just echoing what Jordan said, most users by count are going to experience cruddy sorts of types, and we have a wide proliferation of types using kind for references there already, right? We wrote these new guidelines, to be pedantically strictly correct, which means we went the other direction. And I feel like we are now punishing 98% of our users for what 2% are going to experience. An important 2%, they're using real use cases to be sure, but most of our users are not going to see or know that. They don't know what resources are. And this is my biggest problem with it, is no user knows what these resources are because nobody uses the URLs raw, right? They all use command lines or they use discovery. And so it's completely opaque to people, but they have to memorize a heuristic for converting a kind, which they do know, into a resource path. And most of the time it's doing the exact same thing, that like just take the first match, right? Except they're doing it in their head. So we're forcing our users to do the thing that I feel like we should be doing. So I guess I'm just wanting to echo this idea that our guidelines, I think, should be rewritten with more nuance, such that almost always kind is fine. And when it's not, you know it's not, because you're falling into some other category of criteria, which I don't exactly know how to put in words.
So if we take the controllers that we currently have, so like that use references or have objects that have references, I think RBAC is a good example of one where kind was fine. Ingress, which is expecting to point to objects which are cruddy, is also probably fine to use kind. HPA, I would say, is the clearest entry that of something that should have used resources.
Yeah, that makes sense. And just to clarify, I don't have too much to add other than just for Gateway API specifically, I would say we're most similar to Ingress in the sense that Ingress, the reference is to potentially a custom backend type, but that any backend type that is supported is known in advance by the Ingress implementation. That's the key. And that's same with Gateway implementation. What we're talking about here as references are entirely known by the implementation, the implementing controller that's using the API. It's not the more abstract, here's a reference to an unknown resource that we want to pull some data from. That's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about a known set of types. And that seems to line up with what you're saying here about a kind probably being acceptable. I think
So
Tim
I
may have.
guess-
Did I jump to the front? I wanted to ask about the HPA case. Isn't it like when we do HPA, I'm going to show a little bit of my ignorance here. When we talk about HPA, aren't we always talking about the scale sub-resource? Like we can talk about the parent kind like a deployment or replica set, but HPA itself is going to go straight to the sub-resource, right?
But the HPA has to find that sub-resource. And
right. So it's having to take the kind and translate it to a resource and then call the sub-resource of that. And it doesn't even really care about what the parent kind is, which is why, like, from its perspective, it's it's entirely about the endpoint.
But it's busy. It feels like it's busy work, but it's HPA as a piece of automation can absorb that busy work where humans shouldn't have to, right? Humans crud the deployment, or they crud the replica set, or they crud the stateful set. And when they point their HPA at it, they want to speak in terms of the thing that they own.
So that's assuming the parent is always a CRUD object. If you want to let HPA scale a thing, and the way you interoperate with HPA is by exposing an endpoint that speaks the scale subresource, it feels silly to make you like have a pseudo kind just so you can have a discovery mapping, just so HPA can find your thing.
I feel like you have something in your mind that I'm missing, some example or something concrete. Like, what would you scale that isn't a sort of workload resource, which is already going to have a kind?
Maybe a set of machines on vSphere or AWS.
And there's no resource that models that?
I have a resource, but why would I need a kind?
What is at that resource?
An aggregated API server that has credentials and says scale this set of things up. I don't know what the set of things is. You can't configure the set of things.
Or alternatively, you have an API, but you're using a kind that is also mounted somewhere else. So say you're managing machines and you like the cluster API. And so you're like, why design my own API? This is a perfectly good kind. It expresses what I need. Here's how you can get it and put it. And I've got a scale subresource. Now I want to make HPA talk to my thing. But because I didn't define a unique kind, I can't point HPA at this scale thing. I have to basically copy an API that I would have used as is, just to make it unique so HPA can find it.
This all feels very hypothetical, and like we're punishing the user experience for what feel like hypotheticals, where honestly the pain of don't do that, like define your own kind, like I think that's where we flubbed. Like we should have made it really trivial to say, here's a kind and it tastes like or inherits from or feels like, quacks like another type, like formalizing that.
I can't tell if that's a proposal to change our type system or not.
That proposal may be a little late in arrival, so it's not not exactly a serious proposal. Although, if you had appetite for it, I'd be happy to discuss it. But yeah,
What to your earlier comment about no one knows about resources? Actually, anyone who writes an RBAC policy or an admission webhook knows about resources, because that's how you express policy that only uses.
I will reassert that 90+% of users will never write those resources. They will just be using them.
Let's hear from David, I guess, and then we can open the discussion back up. Oh, David, you lowered your hand, huh?
I started talking and I lowered my hand. So the gateway resource, you said it was going to be a small set. I'm curious whether it's actually a set that you know so well you would hard code a REST mapping for it.
No, sorry. Sorry. Go ahead. Sorry. I'll.
If you didn't hard code a REST mapping for it, what would happen if the first one of discovery was no longer the one you expected?
Okay, yes. So I think there's a few things here. So Gateway API combines a few resources. We're calling it Gateway API, but it includes Gateway and several routes. A lot of our references are within Gateway API. So there, you may want to describe how a route attaches to a gateway. That's a reference. But we wanted to leave a little bit of room out there instead of just, we default to you attach to a gateway in your object reference. But we wanted to leave room out there for implementations to provide their own flavor of route parent, their own. So an implementation, a controller may include its own set of resources that it supports to extend the API. The controller would understand those resources and know them because those would be unique to that implementation of the API. So we have this kind of well-defined core that's what we expect the vast majority of references to be, but we also allow for implementations to bring and support their own resources and reference those using the same reference types. This is really similar to the Ingress API, where you support we support forwarding to a custom backend type. We don't expect that custom backend type to be knowable or understandable by a large set of implementations. This is something that's really implementation specific, and each controller could, I don't know of any controllers actually using this right now, but they could forward to, say, a storage bucket that's proprietary to their implementation of the API. So that's really the kind of extension mechanism we're talking about here, a known set of resources for that given controller.
So it is not unlikely that a specific gateway implementation, their implementation of it might be like the RBAC implementation. It's like, we support this one kind. And so if there's a gateway we're supposed to be handling, we expect the reference to be like this kind, and that's it. And
yeah,
if it is, then we'll look it up this way. And if it's not, we might error and say it's unhandled or ignore it, or like.
That's exactly it. Yeah,
I'll go further. I think actually every implementation has a list of known kinds that it knows to handle, but we as the central piece do not know the union of all of those lists.
I feel like we may not know them as the architects, but as we're exploring an API at runtime or doing writing conformance, the ability to detect and find those. I know that when we did our early stuff to see what the different combinations were for the different attributes within Kubernetes, there were, I think, 77,000 different combinations that we don't test much of. And what I wonder is if there's a way that, similar to how we've done it with the Ingress API, if there's not a way to simplify it rather than having this pointer or aggregated API server dangling in the middle of our core implementation, going to stable basically.
I don't think the Ingress API is simpler. I think it's equivalent. The Ingress API gives a spot where a specific Ingress extension can point to their own typed object. That sounds the same as this.
That's right. And in theory, I could point my gateway or my ingress at a secret or a config map, and that would be schematically valid, but my controller would go, I don't know what to do with that, and ignore it or cause an error.
Or maybe your controller would perfectly handle a config map. They say my custom type is config map, and here's how I pull data out of the config map.
Right. My point being, I as an end user should know through documentation right now what my implementations do or don't support. I can schematically say any kind I want,
right,
and that it will pass validation, but it may or may not be useful to the controller. So actually, Hippie, you said something that was interesting. Sorry, am I jumping? No, I'm still up. You said something that was interesting. Like, is it useful to expose that? Like, should we have controller implementations list the kinds that they know they support somewhere? A little bit more like going shopping.
It would be less surprising for sure.
I don't think that's covered at all in the Gateway API today. I know it's not covered in Ingress, right, Rob?
Well, I think if we were to do
it is
that,
not.
it would need to be on a per reference basis, right? I mean, the controller might support a bunch of kinds, but it may
Oh.
support these kinds in this reference and these kinds in another reference and these kinds in another reference.
Yes, sure. Yeah, yeah. And I have no idea, even off the top of my head, how we would want to implement that. I don't think we could
Yeah.
reasonably like use it for static validation. Oh, you put this into this field and that field only supports these types in this API. Like, I can't even imagine how to do that.
That's painful, yeah.
We have been trying to explore ways we could describe that in a generic and consistent way on the gateway class resource, a very similar parallel to ingress class. I think the same concepts apply to ingress class as well, as this given ingress class supports forwarding to these specific backend types, kinds, resources, whatever we want to call them. I think there's maybe a way, but it's a little weird to get there. But I agree, that could be a useful concept.
Sorry, is it okay to just chime in? Right. I've actually been kind of thinking through this problem with like Antoine Felice on API expressions, and we kind of wrote up this doc that has a proposal. It's basically leveraging open API extensions to document sort of what the referent types are and categories. So this is a far off idea if people want to look at that, but that was one approach.
That sounds really interesting. I don't think it changes the larger conversation here, which is really, I guess the question I'm asking is, should we revisit the guidance that you wrote, Yusuke? Thank you for writing it. Should we revisit that with some more subtlety to it in terms of what we should give people guidance when they're producing APIs?
Yeah.
As an API reviewer, I love black and white. As an API producer, I don't think black and white satisfies.
So I think just want to provide some context on the conversation. I think, yeah, Jordan was involved, and so is I think David, who might be in this meeting as well. So I'm primarily defer to them because I think they give a lot of feedback on it. My personal opinion is I do feel like kind is so well entrenched that yeah, we probably have to provide some, at least comment on the use of kind versus resource. And I just read Rob's proposal on the email, which I thought was pretty sane.
David, go ahead.
So I do not want to go as far as declaring that different resources with the same kind and different resources using the same group kind is strictly not recommended. I don't want to do that. Having dealt with the consequences of systems built on kind that are not able to hard code their own REST mapping, their own concept of this kind means this resource. And RBAC is an example where we effectively can't. This kind means this resource. The systems that are unable to hard code that have unfortunate failure modes. And you can see this if you run the admission plugin that protects you from owner references preventing you from deleting your own resource. And when discovery doesn't work, that admission plugin fails and it blocks create or update. But having a fixed mapping sounds like, if you could describe it as a kind and get the fixed mapping, I would like that. How that can be done for a custom resource, I'm not actually sure. I'm sure we can come up with something, but having a fixed mapping would make it at least predictable, and it would allow a user to specify a kind, which I will concede they're more familiar with it because everyone loves writing YAML.
Are you suggesting a mapping that is visible in the API, or is it sufficient to say, in this circumstance, gateway, every implementation has a fixed mapping that it knows? It may not expose it anywhere, but it knows it. And therefore, kind is satisfactory as an API.
I think if you truly know the mapping and no one would have to actually look it up, that sounds okay. If you have to look it up, and again, owner references, this happened, like weird things happen in garbage collection. Unexpected things happen in garbage collection when discovery is unavailable. And having a way in an owner reference to say, like, this is generic, but I'm going to map X to Y, and this is now your resource, would make it easier to know what was going to happen, I think.
Could we consider that to be like an additive thing? So let me try an attempt at a principle for the guidelines for API review. If you're building a reference that the implementation has a fixed mapping of kind to resource, then it is acceptable to use kind. And it would be really nice if you expose that mapping somewhere, but that's optional. And if you can't build that mapping, if you can't build that static mapping somewhere, then you really ought not use kind, because it'll explode in your face.
I think I can get behind that. I think that expresses what I want to happen both on the controller side and what I think I expect to happen on the resource author side.
And that gives us room to then iterate on, maybe we want a general mechanism for exposing that mapping, or maybe it's very subsystem specific. We can figure that out async to the rest of the work.
I think it would have to happen async, because I know that, like, so my understanding, I think, of like the patterns in, for example, controller runtime for doing watches is all based on kind, which I think does disambiguate via the REST mapper. So it's not like you're providing a static mapping to basically make that happen. You are relying on I think, discovery there. So I don't know if it's also good.
Suppose hypothetically we expose REST mapper as an optional thing, and subsystems could somehow, through the magic of names or something, expose their custom REST mapping for their subsystem. So I create a REST map instance for that links back to a specific gateway class and says, for this gateway class, if you're a client, use this REST mapping instead of discovery. Like, that feels like something we could iterate towards, maybe.
Yeah, that seems fair. I have maybe a later question about sort of like how much work we want to action on around these ideas that are kind of popping up besides just amending the guidance, but makes sense.
I think the guidance is the most urgent thing.
Lost me with the custom mapping, Tim.
Yeah, I kind of lost myself too.
Okay.
It's more like
that sounds awful. I mean, it sounds great if we hate users and like want to make sure everyone's confused.
But users don't need to deal with it, because we could build that into the clients and the discovery, so that if I provide something that's ambiguous and it's in a particular context that is somehow derivable, which I don't know how to answer that, then I can disambiguate.
Anytime we have API service that has references, we can't assume that we know all the clients that are going to follow those references. And the more ways there are to turn a reference into a URL, the more likely it is you're going to get like incompatible implementations. So right now there's basically 3 ways. There's the like pluralized using code that adds S. There's use discovery, and there's hard code. This kind goes to this endpoint. If we have like a 4th, like in this context, kind uses a mapping defined over here, like that seems bananas to me.
Well, that's effectively what the hard code is, right? It's just built in as one mapping, right? So if you're saying in this context, I mean, it is. I hear you. It sounds.
The hard coded. That my expectation is the hard coded one is always a subset of like what you get from discovery in a standard cluster. So it removes the issues with like
Often the
hitting-
hard-coded one I would expect to be in a controller that's a special, like gateway, some specific gateway controller would say in my context, this is what this kind means in this particular reference. And that's the hard coding I'm talking about. And you could make that, if you want a generic kube control style clients to be able to disambiguate or figure out, follow that reference, then you could make that information discoverable rather than hard coded. But I don't know the value in making that trackable. I mean, I can see some cases like some sort of configuration consistency checks and things like that potentially it being useful. But anyway, I'm digressing.
I agree. I don't think it's necessarily super useful. I just think the fact that it's plausible makes it feel less awful to me.
Yeah, I think the guidance around resource was primarily around avoiding failure modes. Like saying if you specify a kind and it's a generic reference that we can't bake a lookup map ahead of time, then we're going to have to use discovery. And that introduces failure modes that you probably haven't thought through. And so if we could just shortcut that by saying, this is the resource I meant, like that seemed nice.
Yeah, I think it's fair to include that. Like, it's fair to just start including the caveats, right? But then acknowledge that in the current world that exists, there's many people that do the kind. So if you do that, here's kind of what you have to worry about. You have to worry about disambiguating and making sure that, through whatever, I guess, of the mechanisms you have, right? I think another control mechanism you kind of have is hopefully, complete ownership of the kind and resource that you're kind of referencing. So, you can basically guarantee some level of sort of like one-to-one mapping by having complete ownership of the resource and kinds that you're referencing.
But I think that was David's point, though. You can't guarantee that one-to-one mapping. Like, you can't control whether someone exposes that kind at an additional endpoint.
Yeah, that is certainly true. Well, if you control, yeah, I mean, the people can't basically gain complete ownership over a group version, right? So I guess other people could always re-register, mount, a group resource, I guess. Okay, I think I see what you're saying. A resource someone could mount a resource that could go reference someone else's group kind and then thus create the ambiguousness.
Hippie's had his hand up for a long time.
Yeah, I'll stop.
Thank you. I want to remind us all that when we define what Kubernetes is for everyone, we currently have an API server that's spun up, and we do a explore of that and dump it. And if what we're doing is going to change that process, we should keep it in mind. What we're speaking of right now, I am not sure how that fits, because these API servers that are underneath aren't spun up in that line of code that generates the open API JSON. That is the definition of what of conformance in Kubernetes. And I'd love to hear more about how this decision influences that.
I don't think this is contemplating changing how the built-in types and endpoints operate. I think this is mostly trying to figure out how references to extension types, so by definition, things that would not be part of Kubernetes conformance, are modeled.
So I asked a question in the chat, and David, I see your answer, but I'm not sure I understand your answer. Just to come at it from a different direction. What if we said, in fact, resources is correct, and we spent the time to go back through all of the existing APIs that do object references and add resource alongside kind, and then auto-populate it whenever possible, and start to put it in user space instead of saying, well, we didn't, so we shouldn't.
I have a PR for you. I tried it with garbage collection, And what happens today is there is a property today where, at least for GC, you can create a reference to a thing that doesn't yet exist, whether that's like good or bad or otherwise. Like, it's a thing you can do, and it makes the resource mapping potentially late binding. And so I had difficulty bringing it to fruition.
Well, this was kind of what I was trying to say earlier, that if we lay resource alongside kind, then if people don't specify resource, we use a canonical fixed mapping of that. I mean, I guess or the existing discovery, but that people can also specify resource if they actually care in that particular reference. This kind of provides the backwards compatibility and sort of works as users would expect. Now, if they provide an inconsistency between the two, then either resource takes priority or you puke or something. But to me, that's, like I said, would match how users expect it to work. Oh, we're used to just putting in kind, but oh, kind's not sufficient to disambiguate here. I'll add resource, and that's it. So anyway, Tim, your hand's up still. We are just about out of time, folks. Well, we have 8 minutes left, so we have some time, but we should try to figure something out as far as, it sounds like we have some suggestions as far as the updated guidance, but.
I would love to see us take a swag at the updated guidance as we described. So I guess the question then is, who wants to try to write that?
Yeah, I was going to ask the same question. So,
well, Yusuke, your fingerprints are all over it, so clearly it should be you.
I don't mind, but I also know Rob is the one who actually suggested. Sorry,
Ooh,
I'm not. I
good
want to give
point.
opportunity more than you know.
Good
I want to
point.
take credit for a good argument that Rob started. Does that make sense? So maybe Rob, is between you and I.
I'm happy to try to take this one on. I don't know how successful I'll be, but maybe we can collaborate on this.
Sounds great.
Okay, well, then I guess that was a pretty good discussion and we're making maybe some progress. So any, in that case, if we've got our volunteers or victims or whatever you want to call them, then any other business we need to address on this? Okay, awesome. Then we can all have 5 minutes of our lives back and have a great rest of your week, folks.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
Cheers.
I love these meetings.